The UAW had developed a plan where they would pick a small plant which made vital parts for the auto industry, and then they would strike in that plant, and that would shut down all the other. And in the interim, the other workers would get unemployment comp because they were forced out of work.
Right.
So Romney developed this bill which basically said that if a worker who was unemployed as a result of a strike in one of the plants, of which his union was a member, that they would not be eligible for unemployment benefits. And we had the majority then in the Senate at that time and in the House. And I think that maybe George Van Persem was the
state chairman.
And
state
Piers,
Republican chairman. And
Piers was the Speaker of the House.
Don Piers was also from West Michigan.
And they worked out we worked out the agreement to pass it.
And that was back in 63, 64 during your first term.
And that was the only major labor bill which labor opposed violently and lost.
Yeah, and the Democrats, of course, also would have opposed it almost purely, but because the Republicans still controlled. Yep. Now in 65, 66, you never could have gotten that through because the Democrats had control of the House and Senate.
But Romney was just adamant on that bill, and he could be, of course, very forceful and persuasive.
Right.
And there was just no other way than it was going to pass, and it passed.
All right, so you come to 1966. And that was a much better year for Republicans. You may remember George Romney was running for the first 4-year term that a governor ever got under the new Constitution. He was running with Bill Milliken. You were running for your third term, and the first time you, as a state senator, would get a 4-year term. And what happened in that election?
Well, the Republicans did well. But
I'll say
you were probably elected to that.
No, I was a couple of years later. But
it gets a little vague. But I think we might have ended up with a tie vote. That came later. The tie vote.
You were ahead 2018 the Senate, so you picked up 5 seats. You went from 15 to 20. The Democrats lost 5, so it was 2018. In the House, the Republicans picked up 18 seats. And they tied, but they organized because one of the Democrats defected, and then they had a special election, and the Republicans won that. So they had a narrow 56-54 majority. But anyway, you were back in the driver's seat, and Romney was governor. So along comes George Romney's idea of a state income tax. Now, what about that? Because Michigan had never had an income tax, and it's kind of ironic nowadays, with all this debate and controversy over how high the income tax should be, whether it should be graduated or flat, and the Republicans are almost entirely on one side, and that is, ideally, we probably shouldn't have an income tax, or at least should be low, or it should be flat. And the Democrats are on the other side saying the higher the better, and maybe it should be graduated. It was a Republican legislature, of which you were a member, and a Republican governor who actually instituted the income tax.
Well, Romney had Williams had proposed an income tax.
Right.
I think Swainson probably had proposed an income tax. And the Senate always rejected it, and the House did too. Romney came on the scene and made it clear that the state should have an income tax, state income tax, but it was not going to be graduated. It would be a flat rate.
Well, that's written right in the Constitution. Yeah.
And the moderate Republicans, most of us, bought into that and said it's a reasonable approach.
What was the feeling and the thinking at that time, from your perspective, about why Michigan should have an income tax? Because we never had one. And a lot of states didn't. And states today don't. There are certain ones that don't have income taxes now.
That's right. I think we look back at the period when Williams had his economic problems and didn't want to go back into that era again.
You thought maybe there wasn't a balanced enough tax structure, maybe too much emphasis on sales and property and so forth, and so let's bring in an income component.
And at that time, people argued, and I think rightly so, that the sales tax was sort of a regressive tax. Later on, of course, food and drugs were removed from the
Right,
sales tax to
right.
make it a little more
Right,
progressive. But
right.
but it was regressive. It hurt poorer people more than others.
The summer of 1967, the state income tax, first one in Michigan history, finally was enacted with almost unanimous Democratic support, where Romney needed enough progressive or moderate Republicans to support it to get it through.
He
and
did.
He did.
And he gave that task to Emil Lockwood, I guess.
Yeah.
To,
there was the famous lapel story. Tell the lapel story.
Well, Emil was an accountant.
Yeah.
And he was not, and he was very bright,
Yeah.
very sharp, and he was not a early supporter of the income tax.
Right.
He really didn't like it. Emil had certain alliances with people. He was almost a friend with everyone. And he had a strong alliance with some of the old-time lobbyists and the old-time movers and shakers in the Capitol. So he was not really on board. And Romney knew that. Romney was perceptive, very persuasive.
Yeah.
And he had this early morning meeting with Emil Lockwood in which Lockwood kind of said he wasn't going to take the bill up. And Romney grabbed him by his lapels and apparently ripped them off his suit coat. And that became the story.
Yeah, that became the big story.
Big story.
He got intense. That was the word. George Romney became intense. And so Lockwood saw the light enough to at least allow a vote, huh? Yep. And then it passed. What about the Detroit riot in 1967? What do you remember about that?
We were vacationing, our family, in Rhinelander, Wisconsin, and we got a call that Romney wanted a meeting on Mackinac Island, and the riots, I guess, had started already, and they were somewhat under control, I think.
Right.
And a state plane picked up Charlie Zoller in Benton Harbor. It picked up in Flint, Garlane, and then I was picked up in Rhinelander, Wisconsin, and Joe Mack was picked up in
the Upper Peninsula,
Ironwood, Michigan,
yeah.
And we flew to Mackinac Island, and that's when Romney unveiled his plan for New Detroit. That he was going to
Detroit, okay.
New Detroit, that he was going to.
And
promote.
what was New Detroit?
New Detroit was an organization of individuals that were going to help improve the quality of life in the city of Detroit, to improve the schools in Detroit, to provide certain state assistance to the city of Detroit.
Were they all people from Detroit or the Metro Detroit area, or were they from all over the state?
I think they were from all over the state.
Okay. And of course, Charlie Zoller, now there was another colorful character. By that time, he was chairman of the Appropriations Committee, right?
And Garlane was the ranking Democrat.
Ranking Democrat, and had been chairman during 65, 66. So, okay, so we get up to Romney deciding he wants to run for president. And then you get up to the election in 1968. You get Richard Nixon, Hubert Humphrey, you get Romney running early on, but pulling out. What do you remember about that? Anything much?
Well, he made his famous Vietnam speech, or his comments.
Right.
He had gone there
to
observe, to get firsthand knowledge, and came home and had a press conference, a small press conference, and asked about Vietnam and how things had changed, and said, I've been brainwashed by the military, and nobody thought much about it for a day or two. I guess that's the way it happened.
It is, yeah. It was on the Lou Gordon show.
Yeah, and finally it reached the media, the mainstream media, and it became a major issue, and it did them in.
Yeah, of course, brainwashing at that time had a kind of pejorative connotation, like there was a Manchurian candidate, and there was brainwashing in the Korean War.
That's what happened.
So any politician who says he was brainwashed, that kind of made people a little nervous. So
it meant that you changed or you lost your basic views, and you accepted the viewpoint of another cause that was not honorable.
Another big issue, very controversial at that time, was open housing. What do you remember about that?
That came in a little earlier with George Romney.
Yeah.
He was a strong advocate of open housing.
Right.
And so was Bill Milliken.
What was open housing?
Well, at that particular time, it was assumed that the real estate people and plat developers and others had used their tactics to deprive primarily blacks from living in certain areas They were more or less shuttled into the ghetto areas.
Kind of redlining them out of.
Well, the banks engaged in redlining. They
Yeah.
wouldn't provide loans
Right.
outside of the area.